This is Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs, editor of Tradition. A few weeks ago, I was very proud that our journal convened the first annual Tradition Today Summit, which was held in Teaneck, New Jersey, bringing together the great minds, thinkers, leaders, rabbis, academics, educators, and some very distinguished younger members of our community to discuss and debate and explore topics related to material success and its challenges. The papers that were presented and circulated and discussed at that event will find their way into the pages of Tradition in the coming year. We hope that the ideas that were discussed at that event will have legs and will get out there into the community and have an impact on our larger communal conversation about this issue. Among the papers discussed and presented was a co-authored item penned by Avital Chizik-Goldschmidt and Chaim Saiman. It's my great pleasure to host Chaim now for a conversation on the Tradition podcast about the topic of their paper, which was called Materialism and the Rise of Modern, Orthodoxy. Chaim Saiman is professor of law and chair in Jewish law at Villanova University's Charles Widner School of Law, and he's the Albert J. Wood Fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Jewish Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Here's our conversation. Welcome to the Tradition Podcast, Professor Chaim Saiman. We were really happy to receive the paper that was presented at the Tradition Today Summit, which was co-authored by yourself and Avital Chizik-Goldschmidt, who's a journalist and a Rebbitzin and a keen observer of Jewish life. And we're delighted to have you here to talk about that.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to write this paper, really to co-write it with two people who I would say have some common interests and some very divergent experiences and realms of expertise. And I thought it was a great idea for Tradition to pair us together. Avital, I think, is very well known as probably the leading journalist who writes for the outside world about firm culture and firm ideas, and really showing our community, I would say, in its sometimes in its best and sometimes in its in its less than best light, both as a mirror to ourselves and outward. I come from a very different place, legal scholar, halakhic scholar, but have recently also become more and more interested in how the ideas that we read in the books get put on meat on the bones and played out in real life and in society, and how social change and halakhic change and communal change are all interrelate. And I thought it was just a really great and promising project to put us both together and to have us overlap our strengths and reinforce those, and each bring steps to the table that the other one doesn't have. And we hope that the final product will reflect the best of that.
Titled Materialism and the Rise of, wait for it, Modern, Orthodoxy. There's a lot resting on that comma. So explain to us what you're doing there, what that's trying to telegraph, because I think it's really central to understand what you're doing in this project, and hopefully at some point in the coming year, when the paper is published in the pages of Tradition alongside the other papers from the event, I think that comma will be pointed to as one of the really interesting insights to what we've accomplished in thinking about this issue together.
Sure. Thanks so much. So, this comes from, traditionally, we think of, there's modern Orthodoxy, and then there's the yeshivish or Haredi world. And that is the world I think that you and I grew up into, that there were these fairly neat categories, and you sort of knew where the boundary lines were and where some of the gray areas are. Increasingly, I think, and myself and Avital think, that this isn't the best way to think about the Orthodox community anymore, for a bunch of reasons. At this point, what we call modern Orthodoxy, capital M, capital O, maybe with a dash in between, is a fairly...
The readership of Tradition.
The readership of Tradition is a fairly small part of the Orthodox pie. If you look at the demographic trends, it is stable, roughly, but since the other parts are growing so quickly, it is shrinking in its relative size. though its absolute size is probably not. It's also shrinking in its ability to define the space and the culture of Orthodoxy. I think, a generation or two ago, because that part of the Orthodox world was most in conversation and visible to the non-Orthodox or the general world, it held a possibly disproportionate sway in sort of forming how Orthodoxy sees itself and how the world sees it. That's no longer true. What we might call, the Haredi community, the Yeshivish community, or really maybe just Orthodoxy that's not modern is probably the best way to think about it, is growing at an amazingly fast pace, and is no longer so much inward focus, but has a high degree of outward focus and activism in the world, politically, socially, economically, etc. And therefore, that is creating what I would call modern orthodoxy, which is, it's not modern Orthodox, but it's clearly a certain a type of Orthodoxy that is in its own way engaged and active in the modern world in exactly the way that 2 generations ago was seen to be the province of what we call modern Orthodoxy. So I think that it's important, we think that's important to name that and to put our finger on it and say, look, there's something new happening here, something different. I think evidence of this we could see in all sorts of ways and all sorts of places. That is a modern Orthodoxy, though it's not modern Orthodoxy.
Right, meaning there's no type of attempt to synthesize the Western civilization and Torah thought. This is not an outgrowth of Rabbi Lamb's project of Torah Umada in any manner. It's a way that community, which, and this will bring us to our next topic, which now benefiting from material success, which in previous generations was unimaginable on the scale that it enjoys it now, are able to enjoy some of the aspects of larger society. You start off the paper with this anecdote, this vignette from the world of online auctions, in which the stender, a piece of rather flimsy, nailed together wood, on which Rav Chaim Kanievsky, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, learned day in and day out, was auctioned for some astronomical fee. And then after, very much after the paper was drafted and circulated, there was this case of Chaim Kanievsky's pair of his pants that went up for auction and were being bidded on for astronomical fees. And
the game jersey.
Right. So you mentioned that once upon a time, the distinctly Orthodox way, or yeshivish way, or Haredi way of demonstrating material or displaying material success was really quite different, and that somebody would display material success in this manner is this very distinctly spending millions of dollars on an item whose value is created exclusively from within the culture of Torah and Orthodoxy. This is a unique turn. In other words, we're not talking about people that are conspicuously consuming fancy cigars and Passover vacations and driving a Maserati, right? In other words, there's something new going on here. So how was this done in generations past? In other words, this is a new phenomena, but how was it done previously?
Yeah, so this story, struck me and struck us, the story of Chaim Kanievsky Stender, precisely for many of the reasons you're highlighting. So I don't know where the Chazon Ish's Stender is. I don't know where the Briskerov Stender is. Maybe the family has it, maybe not, right? But a generation or two ago, no one thought that these things were something to be auctioned, and maybe for a what today would seem a minimal sum, right? But here we have, and we're attracted to Reb Chaim Kanievsky in this story for a bunch of reasons. We just had the Patira of Gershon Edelstein, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, and of course before you had Rav Elyashiv, Rav Leib Steinman. There were others in that sort of group who, all in their hundreds and 90s, the sort of very last embers of of the European-born, although all these people lived most of their lives in Eretz Yisrael, but still kind of connected to that, Litvish, Yeshivish, Lithuanian, which means Litvish, world in Eretz Yisrael. And that generation is basically over. And that generation really
we should say the irony, of course, is that all of those figures you mentioned were distinguished for the extremely ascetic lifestyles.
Right. So that's where I'm going, is that these figures, and I think Reb Chaim Kanievsky more than all of them, which is why I think also the mourning. I mean, it's hard to measure these things exactly, but if you take, if you take that group, I think the emotional outpouring for Reb Chaim Kanievsky exceeded that of his, we'll call them peers. And I think there's part of the reason for that is that maybe him more than any of these people, because he wasn't a Rosh Yeshiva, he didn't have a quote job, represented the kind of core essence of this ideology of Precious, which emanates from the Gaon of Vilna and through the Musar movement and through the Yeshiva movement in a slightly different way, which is that one's tafkid in life is to learn Torah, to only learn Torah, and one is willing to make not sacrifices in the way that we say, we pay lots, we here in America pay lots of money for day school and whatnot, but basically living on subsistence level poverty for the sake of Kulo Torah. That is a tradition that goes back at least to the Gra, if not beyond. And every picture of Chaim Kanievsky's apartment, and it was fascinating to watch, whether in the New York Times or in the Yeshivish Haredi press, everybody latched onto this. He lived in basically a 2-bedroom apartment that had nothing valuable except for Svarim. And that's who he was, and that's what he's modeling.
And unbeknownst to him, he was sitting on $1 million stender.
Right, and unbeknownst to him, he was learning, I guess.
Had he known how much that stender was worth, he would have sold it in order to support widows and orphans. Lichora,
that would be very consistent with the way he lived. And that when he dies, and I think this is part of why that was this emotional outpouring, was a sense, well, we are now in a different era. Not just because it's the end of the people with a kind of genealogical and physical connection to Lita, although that's of course connected, but because this ideology of Precious at that level, to that degree, is no longer. And then what almost as a metaphor for that was the fact that the Stender, which more than anything represents his learning in Hasmada, which he was justly world famous for, is then auctioned off to somebody. The Haredi press reports were that someone in America, which makes sense. Different numbers were floated, but a lot of money. And that becomes the way that person is now sort of demonstrating, on the one hand, their fealty to the Olam HaTorah and to the Olam HaYeshivos and to the ideals of Chaim Kanievsky, but in a really, really different way. And part of what Avital and I think is that move is indicative of a certain change, certainly in the American Orthodox world, in which there is now homegrown luxury. And to come back to what you said before, right? So if you go back into both the memory of 2-3 generations ago, the frum world is not a world where there's a lot of luxury outlets. And typically, people who wanted to engage in that saw themselves and were seen as stepping outside of the frum bubble, because that's where the luxuries were. So a Cadillac, right? And we might have to explain to some of the younger listeners, if tradition has younger listeners, what a Cadillac is. But a Cadillac in the 60s, 70s, 80s was the American luxury car, the height of luxury. So when you said, oh, this Jew drives a Cadillac, that was almost like saying he is not from or no longer from, because the frum world had very little money. And it was the non-frum Jewish world that was then sort of ascending through the ranks of the professions, law, medicine, business, etc. And pretty much that's where the money was.
And even if you had, within the frum world, both the modern and the Haredi frum world, there were, of course, a few very wealthy Gvirim that supported operations. They led a much more modest lifestyle because conspicuous consumption.
There's nowhere to spend it.
There was nowhere to spend it. Conspicuous consumption on their part would have been even more seen as more excessive because they were the only ones doing it. Once you have
Right.
critical mass of people that can spend in that manner, it becomes less tsanua for each and every one person to engage in it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So I think there's 2 points there. One, that look, there are always gevirim, right? And there's always wealthy people and poor people. But as you said, when you live in a culture where the markers of wealth and spending are external to the frum world, you necessarily go outside of it. I'll give an example to try to concretize this. So not my grandparents, because they were in a very different place, but growing up, you heard of people's grandparents in the 70s and 80s, Orthodox people who would go on cruises. Now, these were not Jewish or frum cruises in any way, shape, imaginable.
Because there was no such thing.
Because there was no such thing. That's right. So these were general cruises, and they either had dairy or double wrapped fish or whatever. But
Don't ask, don't tell.
There's a don't ask, don't tell. This wasn't part of the frum public discourse because everyone understood that it's a little shady, a little shaky. And, whatever dancing and music and entertainment that was on these ships and the balls and all that was just sort of the general, culture of the time. And when you did that, right, you were leaving your frum bubble and you were going somewhere else. And that's where it was. Or a country club, right? Or right? What was the fanciest restaurant? Luigi Siegel's, right? Which is like a deli. Right. So there simply was nowhere.
I mentioned at the conference that in the lifetime of most of the people in the room, and I'm very proud that we had some very many younger members in the audience, because I really do want them to be stepping into this leadership and thought leaders in our community. But there were, of course, very many of the senior fellows and figures around the tradition table. And I mentioned in the lifetime of many people in this room, the most luxurious, opulent vacation an Orthodox Jew could imagine was the Homoac.
Right.
And now we have Pesach vacation.
That's before my time, but certainly
where people spend tens of thousands of dollars per person to go have Pesach in Morocco and all types of other places.
That's right. So the scale of this has just totally changed. And to sort of come back to your point, there are now internal frum markers, right? So if we take the Stender or broaden out to Gnazim, which is a fairly new auction house of Judaica, whose catalog, I mean, I'm no expert in Sotheby's, but it gives it a run for its money. I mean, this is really well done. Right, and these these Pesach programs that you're mentioning, and all the l'chaims and Sheva Brachas, all these markers of luxury are driven by the frum community, and that's what so struck me about the Stender is that it's not a Michael Jordan jersey, it's not a LeBron jersey, it's not famous art, it's not. It's not even a fancy car, a Maserati or Ferrari, whatever it is. It's something whose value is exclusively within the frum community. And the fact that it attains that market means that, right, this is how markets work. It's not only one buyer. That buyer, implicitly or explicitly, is is understanding that there are others in presumably his class who will value this thing both financially and socially, which is why it's a reasonable investment. By the way, if this was sold for $2 million, the guy might be a genius. He might be able to sell it for 5 or 6. And if it's not the Stender, then it's something else. I mean, I think this is the point, that a market only works when there's enough players in it to keep both the social capital of this jersey or of the Stender, and the financial capital. Just like, and I was going to jerseys, right? Just like if all of a sudden the bottom falls out of the NBA or the NFL, all of a sudden that memorabilia is not worth much. So this is also a prediction of the future direction of the community, that these prices, and again, I look here not just at the Stender, but at this whole world, are going to continue to go up, which is what makes it, I think, a shrewd investment, though no one should take business advice from me. That's really different from a world in which your markers of luxury are generated by the outside, by Madison Avenue. And then, if you're from, you may or may not participate.
Well, it is a two-edged sword. There is this kind of consumption, whether it's conspicuous or a little more hidden, of what we'll call, let's say, Jewish luxury items, to spend $2 million on an object formerly studied upon by Avital Yisrael, to buy at auction manuscript pages from some Jewish book or Jewish Judaic antiquities. It's a way of spending your money. Now, there might be, as you said, a business angle to it. People buy art at auction because art appreciates. People might buy a rare Judaic manuscript.
But they also have to appreciate the art,
but
which is, I think, where you're going.
But either they do or they don't appreciate it. No doubt there are people who have their investment counselors buy great art at auction because that artist thought his work will appreciate over the coming years, even if I myself would never hang it in my house. But these are things, this is spending within the Jewish realm. You're buying works of Jewish value and content. But at the same time,
I would go even further in support of, right, that there's a, as you said, a double-edged story here, which is, look, this person is not spending their money on sports memorabilia or whatnot. They're spending it on something. They're showing kavod to Torah. This of course lifts, right, the banner of Torah.
Yes,
and then
absolutely. But it's a reflection of their Jewish values, which their parents and grandparents would not have been able to afford to demonstrate their values in that way. You could even make an argument that Pesach hotels, now it happens that the event that we participated in was held a week after Pesach. So I guess Pesach hotels were very much on people's minds, and there's no doubt that these kinds of luxury vacations, kosher for Passover vacations, were something of the boogeyman in the room, as an indicator of something that's profoundly wrong. But you could argue that even a kosher Passover vacation is an expression of a Jewish value. To celebrate Yom Tov together in comfort with your family cannot be said to be something which is completely disconnected from a Jewish value.
And I think that's the point. So, Pesach hotels are everyone's trigger always. I'm not sure they're bad. I certainly, no one asked me for good reason. But here's what we could say about them. And I think that there's 2 points, one that you brought up and one sort of just behind it. As you said, this, right, it's like, imagine 300 people, in some random week in June, decide to go away to a nice place, right, together with their families. So this would be tagged as chulin legamre, right? Okay, it's a thing people do. And therefore, its register on the frum world and the frum understanding of the frum world would be limited, right? Or kalech l'derech zu, right? 30 people want to go to the Super Bowl. Okay, so they rent a plane or they have a plane and they go to the Super Bowl. And there's very little, they don't start having minyanim and daf yomi before and the halftime show with the rub float. They just
and
go
the
to the
chicken wings are kosher.
The chicken wings are kosher, but this tells us a lot about maybe these few people, but tells us very little about the structure of the frum world. But when it's a Pesach program, and as you said, it's done as a way of celebrating Yom Tov, as a way of being mechabed Yom Tov. You have rabbanim, you have shiurim. You immediately have to advertise these things in the frum press because, to run these things, you need lots of people. And I think this is right. So all of a sudden, it now registers as a product of the frum world. And I think this is a big difference between when you have a couple of gevirim, a couple of families, this all takes place out of sight of the Amcha, right? These things take place behind the palace gates. But as soon as you move from, let's say, the top 0.1% or even top 1% to something like the top 10 or 15 or maybe even 20%, now all of a sudden it can't be sustained in this very, very cocooned world. You immediately need advertising. You need to bring in the influencers to put the stuff on social media to get people
advertising. You need to have the glossy magazines,
to
advertise
exactly
product.
So you now have all this infrastructure, right, that is, and this is what creates the register on the frum world. If you want to think about it in numbers terms, right, that move from the 0.1% to the top 20, right, is huge, right, because that's the difference between something that the Yechidim have and enjoy, to something that is now part of the frum culture. And as we know, right, in American society and frum society, right, that top 20%, that drives the culture, right? Because that's what's the media, and that's what the advertising is. That's the influencers, right? That's what people see. The bottom, occasionally there's an article written about it here and there, but that's not what drives the culture. And I think that to me, like that difference between not looking at 1% or even 0.1%, even 1%, and not looking at the bottom 30%, but that top 20%, that is, I think, and that is really new, that is in some version of this world.
Well, so let me throw this back to you, and I hope you won't think that I'm overly cynical here. Please forgive me if that's the way it seems. But when 99.9% of the Jewish world, the Orthodox world, modern and Haredi and everything in between, just simply did not have the financial wherewithal to support an economy like this, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg. When the Orthodox world had very little money, or enough money to lead a middle-class life, but not a luxurious life, so then asceticism was celebrated as a very important virtue. Suddenly, there's enough money to support a luxury economy, a frum luxury economy. So suddenly, it's not such a threat to Yirat Shamayim. And now, therefore, we develop a kind of in-house luxury culture. We now have kosher cruises where instead of double wrapping fish and the night entertainment being ballroom dancing, we have kosher mahadrim and a mahadrim with the most exclusive Michelin star kosher chef, and dafyomi and shiurim, and talks with the Orthodox influencers about sheklach and who knows what. And so we've created, it's a chicken and egg. We've created an in-house luxury economy to supply that, now that it has become kosher. But the virtue itself of asceticism has deteriorated.
So I think that's partially right. I don't, like you said, it is a chicken and egg question, and it's hard to answer. But we could do two things. First of all, we can trace this change, and then we can think about how it's changing the nature of what Orthodoxy is and what it means. And to me, that's the point. So, Rav Aaron Cutler is someone who looms large in this story, because the foundational narrative of Lakewood is that, and I think it's both the mythology and also pretty close to the historical truth, is that this town is started by someone who comes to America and basically sees American Judaism as lacking. Yoel Finkelman has written about this extensively, and the truth is, the authorized, the quasi-authorized, or even authorized biographies of Rav Aaron Cutler say the same thing. He sees an American Judaism that is largely assimilated, and he very much connects that assimilation to entry into American life, American consumerism, American luxury. In the Mishnahs Rabbi Aaron, which are records of his shmuzin, not that there's one on Lumdis, but this is the one that says shmuzin. It's sort of almost in every page. And you'll hear often that Rav Aaron reset Torah in America, or created the yeshiva movement in America. And what that's getting at is that this idea that what it means to be a frum Jew is to be Moser Nefesh for Torah, to really rebuild Lita, or the Gruz sort of image of Lita in America, where to be Haredi was to really pull back, right? They were called Prushim. It's to pull back from the world, to live only in the Daled Amos of Halacha, and to some combination of emunah, bitachon, and support from others of how it's going to work. Mm-hmm. He's a college. How's it going to work? And for him in that era, and not just him, it was clear that Vayishman Yishrin Vayivat, right? That entry into American culture, into any of these, certainly luxury, but I'm saying by his standards, we're talking about something so far from luxury, even basic necessities, would lead people away.
Right. I mean, you all but say in the paper that if he were to come back to Lakewood today and stroll around Lakewood and the suburbs of Lakewood, the sprawl into these other communities, which were once populated when I was a kid in New Jersey. Those towns outside of Lakewood were populated by I don't know, by whatever the Southern Jersey equivalent of hillbillies were. You say if he would walk around and see the McMansions and the Maseratis and who knows
Well,
what
it's not what I say, actually. It's because it's what his biographer says. There's a book, Living Mishnah Reb Aaron, which is one of these Feldheim type of, not quite biography, but something like biography and inspirational stories. And in there, they record a story that Reb Aaron is being driven around what were then the outskirts of Lakewood and seeing bigger houses. I'm sure it's not what we would call today McMansions.
Bigger houses by those standards were quite small.
Right. I think we would call this a small house today. The driver, the guy driving him, tells him one day the Kol Yungalite will live here. And it's reported that Reb Aaron got upset at him, saying, no, that's not the way it was supposed to live. So, that seems increasingly out of step. The way we think about it in the paper is that there's almost like three sources of precious that enter into the thought of the yeshiva movement in the 20th century. And one is maybe the most classical, which is, look, there's limited time and limited resources in life. And what are you going to spend your life doing? You're spending your life making money, or you spending your life learning Torah? Then there's another one that comes from the Musar school and is articulated, I think, most influentially by Rav Dessler, who talks about it in terms of emunah and bitachon, and says that basically the only reason we need to do hishtadlus, it's an amazing concept, and this goes back to Kelm, that really aliba de'emes, hishtadlus is only needed to keep bechira chavshis in equipoise. In other words, if we would all get the amount of money that we deserve from God directly, then the hashgacha would be so manifest that it would be impossible to deny God's hashgacha. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu needs to give us bechira chavshis, and therefore makes it look like it's one's work that causes it. And Rav Dessler records from Rav Zundel of Salat, who says he bought a lottery ticket every year. And the theory was that if he won, so then there'd be like a makom litlos bo for that, because say, he won because he bought the lottery ticket. And his hishtadlus was limited to that. Now, Rav Dessler writes, look, maybe that's not realistic for everybody. He understands that. And this is why I find Rav Dessler, he's usually the most interesting, because he's typically most attuned to the both sides of the equation. So Rav Dessler says, look, we're going to have a problem here, right? Because if you overplay your hashgacha bona fides, like everyone tries to be like Reb Zundel, so then a bunch of people are going to fall because they're not going to get what they need, and they're going to be toa alakol. And then he says on the other side, of course, we have to understand that aliba de'emes, that's where parnasa comes from. So he says he got a balance. But then, this is the part I found most interesting. He says, listen, also in classic Rav Dessler fashion, that everyone has their nekudas habechira, right there. Today we'd call it the zone, what do they call it now? The Overton window, right? But Rav Dessler says you're responsible for moving it, and moving it away from more hishtadlus and towards greater bitachon. And he says, how do you do it? Well, you do it with another concept that sort of comes from the Grad even before, histapkut b'muat, like as an ethic of frumkeit, making do with less. And he says the way you should face business and commerce is understand that the only reason we need to work is because HaKadosh Baruch Hu cursed Adam Harisha. And therefore you should do it, not with gaiva and pride, but with like, kach nigzar alai. And therefore,
and to do the minimum that's required.
And to do the minimum that's required. And you see this in the Chafetz Chaim, and you see this in a lot of different places where it's very interesting. It becomes more extreme over time of what, if in the paper, we trace a little bit about what Toraso Kevo Malachto Arai means. And, in the Rishonim, there's a variety of options, but it could mean, not in terms of time, but in terms of attitude, importance, its influence on you. And as
you're talking about the kind of not life-work balance, but the Torah
work
balance. Yeah.
Torah work balance. Yeah. And as you get to the Magen Avram and then the Chavetz Chaim, this begins to see of Kidei Parnasaso, only as much as you need. And the Chavetz Chaim in the Mishnah Berurah, right, and in the Halacha Sefer, sort of writes pretty explicitly that a person has to be very honest themselves. Are they pushing? Are they trying to acquire more than they literally need to subside? The Yetzer Hara is always active in that area. So that form of discourse, that form of talk, I think is just much, much less common today. That's called the second one. And then the third one, which is stressed by a variety of writers, but we look to Rav Aaron Kotler, is that like he quotes from the Rishonim that just like fire and water can't coexist, so Ruchnius and Gashmius can't exist. And he says Yisurin are essential, and by Yisurin he means physical discomfort and poverty, are sort of essential ingredients to acquiring the Torah. And he quotes the Brisa de Kinyan Torah in the sixth parak of Avos, and he asks actually a really, what I thought was a really interesting question. He says, look, some of these things, right, Hasmada, Shimush Chachamim, etc. I mean, this is not his language, but essentially saying are of course what you need to study anything, right? Like obviously, if you want to get good at any intellectual field, you got to do this. But other things, right, like miut shena and miut sicha, right, seem to be at best neutral and at most counterproductive. And one of those things is yisurin to success in a field. But he says, no. Miksha achat hu mishnah, right? That is that just in the same way that learning and being around Talmidei Chachamim and Hasmada and are essential to acquiring Torah, so are yisurin and these deprivations. I think those latter two things are increasingly absent from our culture. You'll still, people will still understand, certainly as many people who's learning in Kollel and who give up various career and career options, and everyone understands that, yes, you have limited time and efforts, and you're going to put them either in this box or that box. I think that's still out there. But this sort of Yisurin as a necessary good, as a virtuous suffering, to use different language, and the idea that working too much is a chesaron and bitachon, I think that there's just much less register of that, and much more supporting Torah is a form of learning Torah, using your money for tzedakah, for chesed, which, these aren't, I'm not like, but these, let's notice, these are different nigunim and are subtly shifting the sort of meaning of orthodoxy, certainly certain forms of it.
You've mentioned Rav Aaron Kotler a number of times, so I want to go from Rav Aaron to Rav Aaron. I recall, prior to my appointment to the exalted office of being editor of tradition, I did other things in life, and one of them many years ago, I was once involved in organizing the Purim Spiel at Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Chaim, and there was a skit, a kind of like dating game skit, where the girl is behind the curtain and the different boys on the stage, and it was all like senses of like mistaken.
I believe today we say young men and young women.
Yes. So back then it was boys and girls, and so she asks about what the person thinks that Rav Aaron's greatest contribution has been. So one says, Rav Aaron, he created Torah in the wilderness, Lakewood Yeshiva, The other says, Rav Aaron, synthesis of Western culture and Torah. And the third thinks she's talking about Hank Aaron. But
right,
conversation, to bring it a little bit more home to our religious community and our readers. So within modern Orthodoxy, no comma. So you write that there was this ideal of Torah Umada. It might have passed under different slogans, but we all know what we're talking about, which that encounter with modernity had in some way, it was an attempt to take the best, what Rav Aaron Lichtenstein had said, the quoting Matthew Arnold, the best that's been thought and said, the best of high culture, the best of art, of literature, of the humanities, and to combine them together with Torah and with a Torah lifestyle. So then in the paper, you turn to the audience that was gathered there that day in Teaneck, and you say, beyond the walls of this room, it's hard to see that project as one of great success. In contrast, the yeshivish balabatish world has created a form of modern comma orthodoxy, which is anchored less in the openness to Hegel and Dickens and more towards Hermes and diamond crown cigars. In consumer appetites,
Hermes.
luxury culture, Hermes of the modern world. So here's another aspect of this, because we're not only talking about buying high-end Judaica, and we're not even talking about maybe making a reach and saying, no, spending all this money on the Passover vacation is a Jewish value of family and celebration and etc. But we're talking about sometimes the most, what once would have been considered the most, pardon the expression, the most goyish of pleasures, which now can carry both a high price tag and hechsher. We're talking about the world of whiskey, and we're talking about cigars, and we're talking about things. You brought to my attention this fine publication, one of our competitors to tradition, something called the Macher's Gazette, right? Which I thought, when you sent it to me at first, I thought for sure it was a Purim parody, but it turns out that you can't parody this stuff because it's already a parody. So tell us what we see in the pages of Macher's Gazette. It's not.
Yeah. So just on, I think it's called Macher's Magazine. I'm not sure it's still in print. It might have run a show. In fact, when it came out, there was a very vibrant online debate as to whether this is parody or not. But to your point, right, is that it's today, as you said, we could talk about things that have a frum value to them, but today it's not inconsistent with orthodoxy to engage in whiskey. Of course, got to be kosher, wine culture, right? Think about even kosher things, food, wine and food and entertaining culture, jewelry, right? So Avital, has an eye towards obviously the feminine side much more than I do, and she writes, wrote about some of those things. Whiskey and cigars is kind of very male. But these things are, as you said, I think not all that long ago, were tagged as goyish, just by definition. Even if you had the money, that's not a way he does something, right? And now, right, these are part of, right, the after party of a good simcha is the wine, the brandy and cigar celebration. And these are no longer fine dining, as I said, kosher, of course, but these are no longer inconsistent with from life, and in some ways are becoming not definitional in the sense of necessary for, but certainly a certain banner. And I want to be clear here, right? One of the things that happens is the Orthodox world has grown in orders of magnitude in size, which means there's all sorts of different things going on in there. But this is one of the things going on there. Someone at the conference brought up something I know nothing about, but just the term struck me: Hasidic car culture. Car culture. There's now a thing called Hasidic car culture.
Hasidic car culture used to be a station wagon. The back door was held together with duct tape. Exactly.
Right. So the Rebbe car that you and I grew up with, I don't want to say they don't exist, but they exist less. In a very different way, a little more political. We now know that shuls have shooting and NRA clubs. Again, what was more goyish? So these are all sorts of ways in which something modern is happening within Orthodoxy, right? It's a way in which, it's a way in which Orthodoxy, and not modern Orthodoxy, but self-consciously non-modern Orthodox, is nevertheless acclimating itself and finding itself and reinterpreting the general culture in its own image to create these spaces.
So I want to maybe wrap up with one last question, which is, I think, a challenging question to that world which you and Avital so vividly depict in your paper. Look, in the Haredi world, this modernism is not any kind of synthesis. This is not.
Well, it's a certain kind of synthesis.
Well, but this is not the Lamb, Soloveitchik, Estonian version of synthesis of culture with a capital C, but a kind of justification or hechsher for a type of consumerism which it can now suddenly afford. So the question of how do you present an ideological justification? The ideological justification for mistapek b'muat, of making do with little, of a life of asceticism, of prishut, of modesty in consumerism, that's easy to justify ideologically within a religious worldview. But now to turn 180 degrees and to find a justification for this. So one of the things you mentioned in passing, and it did get some discussion at the conference, was, well, there's a kind of ironic, if not source, then parallel from the Christian world. And that's this notion of the prosperity gospel. Now, we wouldn't use that term here, but the concepts that are marshaled in justifying this modern orthodoxy smack very similar to that prosperity gospel. And that, of course, is very ironic because, in other words, the Haredi world bashed the modern Orthodox world, Torah Umada, embrace of culture, etc., for being too much in affinity with the non-Jewish world. And here, if we're correct that it's this notion of prosperity gospel, which serves as an ideological justification for the phenomena we're describing, that's perhaps the biggest chukat akum of all. It's the largest Gentile influence on a Jewish lifestyle we could possibly imagine. So explain to us a bit what you mean by that, what the prosperity gospel is, how it lahavdil plays.
Sure. Well, let me do a couple things. First, I don't want to put modern orthodoxy should not be let off the hook here, in a variety of ways. Classic modern orthodoxy. So first of all, as I said,
for no other reason than so few people adhere to this ideal of cultural citizenship.
That's right. I mean, part of what we're seeing is that distinction, and as this is how we started, is really blurring, right? So today, if you're going to kosher restaurants and you're shopping in kosher stores and you're engaged in from music and literature and all that, right? So this is these places where these worlds meet. To go and say what's Haredi, what's modern Orthodox, I don't even think that's a useful distinction anymore. I mean, you could obviously at the edges, these things are very clear. So this is our culture as much as our tradition reading culture as much as anybody else's, and we have our own halakhic and share in this as well. I think part of the difference is that the more culturally modern Orthodox you are, the less of a kind of need to wrap everything within under the talus. You can say, listen, I'm going to a ball game, vizel. I've always thought one of the beautiful things, but also it has a double-edged sword of the communities to the right, is that everything has to be wrapped within a Jewish key, within a Jewish context. And this is where I'd say, like, what we have here is not so much an assimilation as much of an interpretation of, or a reinterpretation of, right? Because all these concepts are most of them, not all of them, most of them are in some way subtly transformed into something that is sort of within the Jewish fabric, or tachat kanfei hatalit, if you will, as it happens. So I think that and that, that's what I'm saying, to go back to those two cruises that we talked about, right? There's a lot of good to be said about a cruise where there's minyan and there's, Shabbos, obviously, and there's shiurim and there's daf yomi and there's from entertainment, right? Like there's a power there, right? Something that came up in the conference as well as people talked about, mikvahs have gone from being pretty dingy, dark spaces.
From slimy to spa.
In fact, the reason I know because when I grew up in Atlanta, there was one mikvah. It was generally the women's mikvah, but on Erev Yom Kippur and Erev Rosh Hashanah and whatnot, it was a men's mikvah. I knew exactly what it looked like. A spa it was not. Right, so all these things also make the mitzvah more attractive, get people more into it, widen the tent. Right, so I think that there's a lot of complexity here, and I think that's a little bit your answer. Is to say, listen, we don't live in that world anymore. We live in this world, and one of the things we have to do is always, create, respond to where we're at. The other thing I would say is that, and here I'm a little bit guessing, is that, and you see this particularly in the yeshiva community, right? It's grown to such a degree that it's quite diverse, both in terms of people, but also in terms of institutions. Like, obviously, the yeshivas are at the center of this, but think of all the other chesed organizations, things like Hatzalah, Chai Lifeline. These are just things that sort of most people know. Chaverim, Misaskim, that sort of constitute this world. So it's in some ways, I think this is why it succeeded. Is that very contrary, I think, to what they initially thought. It really now can encompass whether you're the Eloi, right, the lineal and maybe intellectual descendant of the Gaon Mivilna, or if you're just an average person, male or female, right? There's something in that culture for you, which is really different. And I think that's the key to a success. And as that happens, of course, these things come in. So there's a sort of diffusion, but I think contrary very much to that community's own leadership 60, 80 years ago, who were sure that the diffusion would lead to the disintegration of that community. I think that they've radically outlived expectations in being able to pull this together. And part of what this is figuring out how to bring these natural urges and these social concepts within. But as we said, every mila has a chesaron attached to it, and I think that is also part of what we're talking about.
Well, these are all really fascinating phenomena that you've helped us delve into and track. We can only hope that, like Rav Zissel, our faith will be tested by winning the lottery, and then we'll be put to the challenge ourselves. But
and just to go back, Rav Aaron, and we quote this in the piece, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, already 25 years ago, sort of saw this, right? And his critique was, and he writes this in the famous Green Book. Yeah. He says, listen, if you're really a Grunic, right? I think his example is Reb Chaim Volozhin, then I understand that you're always learning in Torah. And I think this is a question for us, for our community, right? And I think we should end it there, because ultimately, right? So that if you're really such a person, then Rav Aaron Lichtenstein says, I understand why any form of engagement in secular high culture is a problem. He says, but if you're the type of person, and again, he was talking in terms that he understood 25 years ago, who's earning extra money to have lamb chops. My favorite thing in this is that Reb Chaim Dov Keller, who was on the Moetzes in the latter decades of the 20th century, talked about plush carpets as that was his sort of example. So then, right, you're already playing in the world, you're earning money, you're going on vacations, you're eating lamb chops. So at that point to say, but I can't divert, the Yom V'Layla means I can't read any high culture. So what I would say, and I think probably it's most appropriate to end it with us, which is, we're kind of in this too, right? So what we see is that a lot of middle and consumer culture easily gets stitched together and imbricated within Yahadis. But what about that high culture? Where is that? Are we, and I'm talking I'm looking at the camera and I'm looking at myself. Are we doing our stated avoda there? Are we living up to our own ideals? And I can't say that the answer to that is always an affirmative yes. And
Materialism and the Rise of Modern Kama Orthodoxy was the paper presented by Chaim Saiman and Avital Chizik-Goldschmidt at the recent Tradition Today Summit, which explored material success and its challenges. Together with all of the other presenters from that event, the authors are writing and rewriting and revising their papers, which we hope will appear soon in an upcoming issue of Tradition. And we will be parceling out other content from that event in other digital formats, such as the podcast you have just listened to. We hope it will generate a conversation across our community about these issues, these challenges, and others. So, Chaim Saiman, as always, thank you for your always interesting, always engaging, always entertaining insights to contemporary Jewish life.
Thank you.